What's up? This is Sam. Today I'm going to review the best game ever, Final Fantasy VII. Oh my god, it's the best game ever. Oh, praise the Lord. Oh my god, nothing beats it. Nothing. It is so amazing and everything and ah. Well, it's actually not. It's a pretty good game. But Final Fantasy VII is a really stubborn fan base of fans that think it's God, and it's just I mean, it is a very popular game. It's a game that definitely did not change video games, like a lot of people think. It's a very good game with gameplay, I would say. Music's pretty good. The the characters are actually just okay. They're not that great. The plot is good, but it's really got a lot of plot holes, and it has a very bad translation that makes those plot holes even worse. With also has a lot of spelling errors in the translation. There's some weird lines that really don't make any sense. um, it's a fun game that you can play a lot. Uh, it has kind of a huge fan base, which is both good and bad. Um, it spawned a lot of sequels to the game and prequels and movie, having children, which is not bad. The only thing that's annoying with Final Fantasy VII is that it kind of blocks out. I don't know. It kind of like gets people to think there's no more good games left when there certainly is. Um, it's either maybe the second or third best Final Fantasy game, true, and actually, it is in some ways the last true Final Fantasy game that Square made. Final Fantasy VIII I thought was a very weird game. It's not so much a Final Fantasy game, but you can't actually say Final Fantasy VIII is a bad game at the same time. It's just kind of weird. Final Fantasy VII, it's good because it's the first 3D Final Fantasy, and that's really what separates it from the predecessor, Final Fantasy VI, which I thought was the best one. FF7 starts out with a lot of action for an RPG. You start off, you bust out of a train and knock out some guards, and then invade a Mako reactor. Um, I like the backgrounds in Final Fantasy VII. It's drawn, very dark. It it probably is influenced to some degree by the old Japanese animation Akira, which everyone has not everyone has seen, but a lot of people who are part of the anime community have seen. Um, the backgrounds look very good in Final Fantasy VII. It's pretty easy to walk around. The camera angles aren't great, but they could be. They're tolerable enough to play the game, and it's an RPG. You're not gonna like fall off a cliff or something. Uh, so it's got nice backgrounds when you walk. Um, the polygon characters look okay sometimes. It gets annoying at other times in the game. Um, those aren't really. There's nothing wrong with the graphics. It's really good that they finally brought Final Fantasy to 3D, and it's a very memorable game by many. It's the most popular Final Fantasy game. Right after, no, it is the most popular Final Fantasy game. After it would probably be six, or I actually don't really know, but it gets kind of annoying with like the very there seems to be somewhat of like hostility between people with Final Fantasy VII versus all these other games, and people tend to fight about it where it's not really something to fight about, and it's also at the same time not something to really defend so much either. It's just first of all it's just a game, Secondly, it's definitely there are definitely other games out there that are really good. A lot of other games, and I mean, it was really a game that sold the PlayStation, which is good for Sony. All right, so anyways, let's go to the main review here. Um, the plot is good overall, but they do make it unnecessarily confusing. It seems they wanted to throw a lot of ideas together. Um, it's got a really good villain, Sephiroth, and Genova, who is the I guess he is the biological clone of her through injection, which you don't find out till way later. Um, from his twisted father Hojo, who injected his baby with the cells of Genova, which is a extraterrestrial invasive life form that lands on the planet and causes a huge, massive hole in the planet, um, the northern crater, which is um, where the final dungeon is. Um, I don't need to go too much in detail. It's got a lot of depth, I guess, with the plot. The characters are kind of bland, I think, though. Except for Cloud, they explain a good amount of Cloud, I thought. It gets a little confusing at times, but it's not like too confusing. They kind of fix up, and we can always do research if you're a little confused on the plot, I guess, and you could always watch the Advent Children movie explains a good amount. It's really not a confusing story or anything. They just don't present it very well, and there's a lot of like bad dialogue that kind of makes it confusing. But it actually is a good story. Um, kind of like Final Fantasy VI's story. It's pretty good. I mean it's enjoyable. It keeps you going. Um, the story is it. I mean it kind of covers the whole game. Where Final Fantasy VI, about half the game is main plot, and then the other half is all gameplay. Final Fantasy VII, the plot pretty much lasts. There's it's involved. The plot is very involved throughout the entire game, except for on disc 3 where you can do your side quests. But the game's pretty much already over by then, except for the final boss, final dungeon, the North Crater. We fight Sephiroth at its core in Genova. Um, so I have no real complaints about the plot except for the bad translation and the some of the confusion. And some of the characters are just kind of bland, and somewhat unrealistic too. Okay, so moving on to the music. I thought Final Fantasy VI's music was a little better, but Final Fantasy VII has really good, catchy, memorable Nobuo Uematsu um, style music, and he does a really good job in it. Actually, a lot of the sounds in FF7 sound very similar to FF8, which that one it sounds kind of similar. It's just a different way of synthesizing the music than the Super Nintendo with FF6. So I mean, overall the music's good. Um, it's just slightly not as good as Six's, but still good. Um, it's very catchy. A lot of these FF songs are just very catchy. You could sing them when you're in the car or just like anytime. You always like be thinking about them at some point. Okay. The characters, they're fun to. Let's go to gameplay. The gameplay is good, with its materia system very similar to FF6's, as I explained in the previous review. The materia system, it's very handy. I mean, it's good that you can customize your magic spells, your commands, your special abilities. It's got those linking materias. Um, it's got the independent materia. So it's a good amount of customization, which is nice for playing the game. You don't feel too restricted, I don't think. That's always a good thing. Um, The game is a little bit harder than FF6. It's not that hard of an FF game though. It's not that hard of a game overall. It's fairly easy to beat FF7. It's just longer in length than FF6, but it's also a beginner's RPG. It's not that hard overall. Um, so, but it is more challenging than FF6. I will say that. Um, and there's a lot more side quests in 7 that take longer. The gold chocobo side quest, which I thought was very fun. It makes the game very interesting that they finally utilize those chocobos for more than just riding from one town to the next. So the chocobo racing was very fun in FF7. Um, it was very fun just mastering materia, then going back to Cosmo Canyon at the end of the game and just keep getting a master block of materia for the different kinds. And all the summons are also in a materia this time. They don't have the summons overall don't have an important plot device like in FF6, but it's kind of back to the old style of just having summon materia just to have it in the game. And the Knights of the Round idea was really good, especially because they added 2 super bosses like in FF5, which is the first one. They added super bosses, um, the FF7 has Emerald and Ruby Weapon, which are fairly challenging if you don't know what you're doing. They're harder than beating Omega and Shinryu from FF5. Um, so those super bosses are are like the game's challenge. Interestingly enough, the super bosses in FF7 were not in the original release of the Japanese version. So I don't know if anyone that's played the Japanese version, but Sephiroth would be your boss, and save for Sephiroth at the end, and that would be it. Uh, so it probably is. I would assume the Japanese version is even easier than the American version. Um, but then they re-released the Japanese version later. Um, I think it was called FF International or World or something. Then re-added those American bosses, which were the Emerald and Ruby Weapon. So they're really the only game's big challenge. Save for Sephiroth is a pretty difficult final boss if you're pretty new at FF and RPGs and just video games, but it's not like that hard. All right, good game overall. Um, recommend it.